The following is an excerpt from Chapter 2, The Compulsively Elusive and Shape-Shifting Mind of John Dee, or How to Think Like a Mathematical Magician. The genesis of what became the Enochian system of magic takes us back to the home of Dr. John Dee and his home, Mortlake, along the Thames River in an area now absorbed by the City of London. Among Dee's more interesting tasks had been picking an auspicious coronation date for England's Protestant Queen, Elizabeth I. We have records of Dee's personal diary, notes in his ephemeris really, from 1577 on, and very early he notes a visit from the Queen, and often from other nobles from her court. His neighbor is Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's master intelligencer in an era when intelligence work meant everything from what we would now call journalism to translating, to ciphering, to talking to the angels. As just one example, consider an intelligence journey that John Dee went on in 1562. While on the continent, he wrote home to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the Queen's Lord Treasurer, saying he needed more time because he wanted to copy the Stenographia of Trithemius, the abbot of Sponheim, which he'd located a copy of. On the surface, the work looks like a textbook on codes and ciphers from one perspective, but from another, it seems about angelic communication. The codes and ciphers described in the first section must be used to read the second section on angelic magic. Scholars still debate on whether the cryptography was a cover for the magic or vice versa. By 1579, according to notes he wrote into his ephemeris, John Dee employed a scryer, a fancy name for a crystal gazer, with the pseudonymously intriguing name of Barnabas Saul. Saul was there to help him talk to angels. Soon after, Saul would leave, and a man named Edward Talbot would appear. Then he seems to reappear as Edward Kelly. He remained Edward Kelly for the rest of their time together, a time during which Dee wrote down various complaints about this unusual scryer, even as he was amazed by what Kelly saw in the crystal. Dee's wife, in particular, seems to take a particular dislike of him, and Jane Dee is much more involved in her husband's life than most Elizabethan women. But Kelly's crystal visions, the shows in the showstone, as Deborah Harkness calls them, are amazing. And Kelly and Dee would talk to the angels together on and off for more than 5 years. Kelly would become a knight of the Holy Roman Empire and die under strange circumstances. Dee and his family would return to England and live out their lives there, but never publicly address the angelic workings. That alone should invite us to step back a bit and ask what led John Dee, by then well known as a geographer, mathematician, and astrologer, and suspected all his life of being a sorcerer and spy, to try to learn the workings of the universe from angels. By most measures of such things, Dee already led a very full life. He had studied at Cambridge, traveled through Europe, and survived decades of religious turmoil as the Catholic England of his birth became Protestant under Henry VIII and the boy king Edward VI, then reverted to Catholicism under Bloody Queen Mary and her husband Philip of Spain. Dee's own father was likely killed during Mary's purge, and Dee wound up in the Tower at the same time as the young princess who would become Queen Elizabeth I. As a distant relative of the Queen, and like her, a survivor, and as a neighbor of her frightening chief of intelligence, Sir Francis Walsingham, Dee may have called himself poor, and he complains about his lack of money often in his diaries. But he would not seem poor to most of us. He lived in a huge house given to him by Queen Elizabeth, filled with servants, and he worked at home, where Jane, his third and much younger wife, managed the ever-expanding household that in time would include 8 children. By the time he decided he had no more to learn from men and sought radical truths from angels, he was old enough to be enjoying the Elizabethan equivalent of a retirement. Scholars who study Dee's work up to the point where Edward Kelly entered his life have tried to place it in many categories. He's been called a Rosicrucian, and his monad glyph, which we'll talk about in a moment, has been described as the secret sign of Rosicrucianism. He's been called a natural philosopher, a geographer, an alchemical philosopher, a mathematician, a Pythagorean, Euclidean, Christian Kabbalist, magician, or perhaps most accurately, a Hermeticist. He did all of this ostensibly in service to the Queen, so perhaps we should call him an Hermetic intelligencer. Dee was a high-level analyst in every Renaissance sense of the term. You can read many excellent biographies of Dee, popular ones like Ben Woolley's The Queen's Conjurer, scholarly ones like Glyn Parry's Arch-Conjurer of England, to learn the external details of Dee's life. But even the very best of these biographies fall down when it comes to talking about Dee's angelic work in any meaningful way. The best recent fictional portrayal of Dee by Dee scholar Deb Harkness in Shadow of Night just sidesteps the angelic workings. You can read about the results of his angelic work in Kevin Kline's rather amazing 3-volume set, The Complete Mystical Records of John Dee. But connecting the external details of Dee's life to his choices near the end of it, and how that informed his partnership with Edward Kelly, requires trying to understand how his highly associative mind worked. Of course, since Kelly was the one who did the scrying, one needs to try to get into his head as well, and we will attempt that in later chapters. Vincent Bridges spent the last years of his life in Prague trying to do exactly this, to understand Kelly's motivations and where his posturing stopped and the real angelic encounters began, and wrote about it in An Alchemical Enigma, a short history of the rise and fall of Sir Edward Kelly. But Kelly is a subject for later chapters. Much more is known about John Dee, and so it is with Dee and his writing that we will begin. We want to briefly take you into the mind of John Dee and show you how compulsively he drew connections and correspondences between shapes, letters, numbers, and the plethora of other things, including both biblical and Platonic stories of human creation. Dee, unlike others like Trithemius, did not simply apply correspondences from Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, or De Occulta Philosophia Libri III. Dee assumed his readers or students knew these things already. He also assumed a set of Kabbalistic correspondences and an arrangement of the Tree of Life that is now widely used in esoterica, and meshed within other correspondences as well, and created, or adapted, a system based mainly upon ancient Greek geometry and Kabbalah, of how these correspondences changed form. Dee didn't leave this behind in a set of knowledge lectures, telling a student they needed to know the Hebrew alphabet and zodiacal and alchemical correspondences, nor neatly, though he did write a compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah, now lost. He either assumed the student knew these things, or else there was some accompanying oral teaching, much as C.H. Jostin suggested in his 1964 translation of Dee's masterwork, The Monas Hieroglyphica, or Hieroglyphic Monad. In that work, more than any other, Dee shows that he had an unusual faith in his ability to come up with a theory of everything, sort of the Christian apocalyptic equivalent of a unified field theory. Because of this, we're going to look at a few examples from the hieroglyphic monad as a way to get into the mind of John Dee. It has long been our contention that the manner of thought implicit in this work may well have been part of what allowed the later Enochian work to come through. It is also certain that the kind of correspondences one needs to know in order to understand the monad are very similar to those that some secret societies, most obviously the original Order of the Golden Dawn, assumed a student needed to know for the ritual work into which they wove Enochian. Written in 1565, almost 2 decades before the start of the Angelic conversations, the hieroglyphic monad even has a frontispiece, shown here, which announces its hermetic context. It also provides symbols of the 4 elements and quotes from Genesis, and of course includes Dee's monad glyph, Dee's 2-dimensional symbol of everything that looks like a stylized sign for Mercury, inside an hermetic egg. The same monad glyph appears on Dee's much longer Propaedumata Aphoristica, 120 theorems that apply physics and astronomy or astrology to navigation. Dee sent a copy of this tome to none other than mapmaker Gerard Mercator. In the hieroglyphic monad's prefatory letter, directed to King Maximilian II Habsburg, who was about to become the Holy Roman Emperor, John Dee tells us that he will explain his monad symbol in terms of mathematics, magic, Kabbalah, and anagogy. Dee proceeds to do this, starting with a point, a line, then a circle. Sometimes he seems to be talking about Kabbalah. Sometimes he seems to discuss Greek myth. Then he'll return again to a point and how a particular point emits light. By the time he reaches Theorem 20, it appears to us that he has stumbled onto the idea of a hypercube. And indeed, Vincent Bridges often claimed that an intuitive knowledge of the 4th dimension was the holy grail of Dee's sacred geometry. By theorems 21 and 22, Dee is diagramming out a system for ceremonial alchemy, or what we might today call ceremonial magic, whose intent is to purify the vessel of the operator. A point, a line, a circle. Those from Golden Dawn backgrounds know that you, in most of the modern GD spin-offs at least, began your first grade by meditating upon a point. That, and the material in the knowledge lectures themselves, makes us strongly suspect that whoever put those materials together knew something of the oral teachings behind the hieroglyphic monads. We also suggest that such guided meditations, and note a good place to begin is simply to visualize a point, a line, and a plane. Being able to visualize is the first key to magical invocation, and also something we do all of the time anyway. The key, magically, is to focus and control your visualizations. When you visualize forms during these meditations, see them as made of light. Keep your mind clear, except for the forms. In the monad, Dee clearly intends for his audience to be able to imagine and transform shapes in their head, something he has been doing all of his life. He also implicitly expects his audience to be able to flip figures from 2D to 3D and back. So circles imply spheres, but may become circles again. Squares become cubes and become squares again, and so on. If you are doing this the right way, you are guided by spirit to see the correct form. That's a concept drawn almost directly from ancient Greek and Christianized as Neoplatonism in the Renaissance. An expert in ancient Greek, Dee was particularly interested in Greek geometry. He had many Greek geometric texts in his library. One suspects that Dee was constantly invoking geometric forms, though he would not have used those words. Why do we say this? Because that's what the ancient Greek texts he knew well, asked for students of geometry to do, just by the way they were written. Here, we need to quickly explain two things: what geometry was to the earliest ancient Greeks, and how they practiced it. If you have already gone through Terry's class on the monad, as quite a few of you here have, you know much of this next section and may want to skip ahead. In school, you may have studied Plato's conception of ideal forms. The idea that an object here on Earth is but a reflection of the perfect concept of that form, or as Neoplatonic Christians would put it, a perfect form in the mind of God. Geometric shapes are the very first of these forms. In the Timaeus, Plato's most radical work, and the one which explicitly mentions both large world cycles and ancient Atlantis, Timaeus describes the creator as a craftsman. The craftsman constructs the body of the universe out of the four elements and four of the five regular Platonic solids: the tetrahedron, fire; the octahedron, air; the icosahedron, water; and the cube, earth. Timaeus tells us that the remaining regular solid, the dodecahedron, which most nearly approaches the shape of a sphere, is used for the universe as a whole, giving rise to the idea that the shape of the dodecahedron partook of great mystery, and that Plato visualized the universe's secret shape as a dodecahedron. Geometry was very literally the study of creation. You hopefully recognize the forms mentioned above. We could show them to you, but you need to have them committed to memory soon. So if you don't know what a tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, or icosahedron are, you should stop right now and go find out. Print out copies and keep them where you will always see them. Or buy some plastic math manipulables and keep them around. Can you mentally visualize a cube inscribed in a sphere that is inscribed in another cube? You need to be able to. You may have already made this last thing part of your visualization for the pentagram ritual. Don't keep reading if you don't understand what we are saying here. Take the time to learn this, or recall it from a geometry class years ago. You can't do Enochian magic if you can't visualize forms. We will spend the next chapter talking about this more. But start now. Plato's ideas infused the work of the most famous Greek geometer, Euclid, and it was none other than John Dee who wrote the preface to the first English translation of Euclid, that of Sir Henry Billingsley in 1570. In reading Greek geometric texts such as Euclid, even the grammar used helps reinforce the idea that there are perfect and always changing shapes, and the goal of a student of geometry is not to measure this world as we might now think of it, but to recover the perfection of those forms as created by the original craftsman. The grammatical form used creates the implicit presence of what Fowler and Teisbach call the helping hand. The unstated something, often expressed in the passive future perfect tense, that makes sure that the line will have been drawn correctly, and thus also implies a perfected state at some point in the future. The helping hand is always there to make sure your lines are perfectly parallel or your perpendiculars properly dropped, because they will have been dropped already in this grammatical tense. Once you solve the problem, that tiny part of your universe has been perfected. Do you see what this means for someone who studies geometry in ancient Greek and combines it with Christianity and Kabbalah as Dee did? It means that it was a deeply spiritual preoccupation, first, and second, that he was constantly invoking forms, whether or not he called it that. If you could go back and remote view Dee's home in Mortlake, you'd probably see a place cluttered up by his books and surrounded by a plethora of very precise astral shapes, transforming from one into another, sort of a multi-layered Renaissance version of Buckminster Fuller's Jitterbug. Like a sonnet writer, Dee plays constantly with language, but always stays constrained by particular forms. While you don't need to study the entire monad, you do need to be able to visualize creatively while keeping your thoughts ordered by the intent of formal perfection. Dee was a master of this. The chapter continues, but for now, we'll stop here.